April 30th, 1945, the Führer bunker, Berlin. Eva Braun had just become Eva Hitler in a ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes. Within 40 hours, both would be dead. What none of the wedding guests knew was that Eva represented just one thread in a complex tapestry of women who had attached themselves to the Nazi regime's most powerful men, women whose fates would diverge dramatically based on choices made in the coming days. These were the wives and mistresses of the Third Reich's elite, women who had enjoyed unimaginable privilege while their husbands orchestrated genocide. Their stories reveal how proximity to absolute power created lives of luxury built on foundations of horror, and how justice, escape, and reinvention would determine their post-war destinies. The women of the Nazi elite occupied a unique position in the Third Reich's hierarchy. While Nazi ideology confined women to children, church, and kitchen, the wives of top officials lived in estates confiscated from Jewish families, wore jewelry stolen from concentration camp victims, and entertained in halls decorated with looted art. They were simultaneously powerless within the regime's masculine structure and complicit in its crimes through their enjoyment of its spoils. Emmy Goering, wife of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, embodied this contradiction perfectly. Emmy Goering had been a moderately successful actress when she married Hermann in 1935. The wedding was a state spectacle attended by Hitler himself. Hermann Goering's position as Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe provided Emmy with Karenhall, a massive hunting lodge named after Goering's first wife, filled with masterpieces stolen from across occupied Europe. Emmy hosted lavish parties where champagne flowed and guests dined on delicacies while millions starved in ghettos and camps. She maintained later that she knew nothing of the Holocaust, a claim difficult to reconcile with her husband's position as one of its chief architects. When Germany collapsed in 1945, Emmy faced a choice that would define her remaining years. She surrendered to American forces with her daughter Etta, betting that her lack of direct involvement in war crimes would spare her the harshest consequences. She was correct. While Hermann was convicted at Nuremberg and committed suicide hours before his scheduled execution, Emmy served only 1 year in prison. She emerged in 1946 to find herself stripped of wealth and status, but alive and free. She spent her remaining decades giving interviews, writing memoirs that portrayed Hermann as a misunderstood patriot and living on a modest pension. She died in 1973, having never acknowledged the criminal nature of the regime she had served as First Lady. Magda Goebbels chose a different path entirely. The wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Magda had been the regime's model German mother, producing 6 children whose names all began with H in honor of Hitler. She had managed her husband's numerous affairs with cold pragmatism, understanding that divorce would damage his position and hers. Beautiful, educated, and politically astute, Magda was one of the few women Hitler genuinely respected. She had stood beside Joseph at countless rallies, her perfect Aryan family presented as the future of the Reich. As the Soviet armies closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Magda made a decision that still horrifies historians. Rather than flee or surrender, she chose to follow Hitler into death, and she insisted her 6 children would accompany them. On May 1st, 1945, the day after Hitler and Eva's suicide, Magda drugged her 6 children, ages 4 to 12, with morphine. Then, with the help of an SS dentist, she crushed cyanide capsules into their mouths as they slept. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, and Heide died without waking. Hours later, Magda and Joseph walked into the garden of the Reichschancellery, where an SS guard shot them both at their request. Magda's final letters reveal a woman so thoroughly consumed by Nazi ideology that she preferred murder and suicide to allowing her children to live in a world without Hitler. Lena Heydrich presented yet another variation on the theme of Nazi wives. Married to Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, and one of the most feared men in the Reich, Lena was by many accounts a true believer who shared her husband's fanatical anti-Semitism. She had encouraged his career, provided him with intelligence. She gathered through social networks and gloried in his power. When Czech resistance fighters assassinated Reinhard in Prague in 1942, Lena became a widow with 4 children and a substantial pension based on her husband's rank. After the war, Lena remained unrepentant. Arrested and detained until 1948, she was never charged with war crimes, despite clear evidence of her ideological commitment. She lived until 1985, running a bed and breakfast on a small island, where she openly displayed Nazi memorabilia and defended her husband's actions to anyone who would listen. In interviews conducted in her final decades, Lena insisted the Holocaust had been exaggerated, that her husband had been a patriot, and that she would marry him again given the choice. She represented the women who never renounced, never apologized, and never accepted that they had been part of history's greatest crime. Margarete Himmler, wife of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, lived a quieter but equally troubling post-war existence. Margarete had married Heinrich in 1928, when he was still an unknown chicken farmer with extremist political views. She had supported his rise through the SS ranks, managed the household as he orchestrated genocide, and raised their daughter Gudrun. Unlike some Nazi wives who claimed ignorance, Margarete's correspondence reveals she knew significant details about concentration camps and approved of the regime's racial policies. Heinrich abandoned Margarete in the war's final days, fleeing in disguise with his mistress Hedwig Pothest. He was captured by British forces and committed suicide via cyanide capsule in May 1945. Margarete was arrested and held until 1948, but never prosecuted. She lived until 1967, maintaining correspondence with other unrepentant Nazis and supporting her daughter Gudrun's efforts to rehabilitate SS members' reputations. The absence of prosecution for women like Margarete reflected post-war authorities' focus on male perpetrators and a broader unwillingness to fully examine women's complicity. Ilse Hess, wife of Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, experienced perhaps the most prolonged connection to the regime's consequences. When Rudolf made his bizarre solo flight to Scotland in 1941, attempting to negotiate peace, he left Ilse behind to face Hitler's fury. She was briefly imprisoned, but released when authorities determined she had no knowledge of her husband's plans. After the war, Rudolf was sentenced to life imprisonment at Nuremberg, and Ilse spent the next 46 years campaigning for his release from Spandau prison. Ilse never renounced Nazism. She raised their son Wolf Rudiger to revere his father and reject the Nuremberg verdicts. She published books portraying Rudolf as a peace-seeking hero, ignored the genocide in which he had been complicit as Hitler's deputy, and maintained contact with neo-Nazi groups. When Rudolf died in Spandau in 1987, at age 93, Ilse organized his funeral as a rally point for Nazi sympathizers. She lived until 1995, dying at age 96. Having spent a half-century in service to a memory she refused to see clearly. Not all women connected to top Nazis remained unrepentant. Some attempted reinvention with varying degrees of success. Henriette von Schirach, wife of Hitler youth leader Baldur von Schirach, published memoirs that acknowledged witnessing deportations and expressed carefully calibrated regret. However, her focus remained on her own suffering, rather than that of the regime's victims, a pattern common among those who sought partial rehabilitation. The Mistresses occupied an even more complex position. Hedwig Pothest, Himmler's longtime mistress and mother of 2 of his children, disappeared into obscurity after the war, living under assumed names and successfully evading prosecution. Eva Braun's choice to marry Hitler and die beside him in the bunker represented perhaps the ultimate expression of devotion to a man responsible for unspeakable horror. Her letters and diaries reveal a woman focused on personal romance while willfully blind to the genocide surrounding her. The women of the Nazi elite benefited materially from the regime's crimes. They wore stolen jewelry, lived in confiscated homes, employed enslaved labor, and enjoyed luxuries purchased through plunder. Some knew significant details about the Holocaust. Others practiced willful ignorance. Nearly all enjoyed privilege, directly derived from genocide. Their post-war fates varied dramatically based on factors, including their husbands' positions, evidence of personal involvement, strategic choices at war's end, and the priorities of occupying forces. Most faced limited consequences compared to their husbands. The focus on male perpetrators, combined with era-appropriate assumptions about women's limited agency, meant many escaped prosecution. Some lived comfortably on pensions, derived from their husbands' ranks in criminal organizations. Others struggled financially but remained free. Almost none expressed genuine contrition for the regime's crimes, focusing instead on personal losses and defending their husbands' reputations. The divergent paths of these women reveal important truths about complicity, privilege, and justice. They demonstrate that proximity to evil, even without direct participation in specific crimes, creates moral responsibility. They show how ideology can consume individuals so thoroughly that they choose death over repudiation. They illustrate how systems of justice often fail to fully account for crimes committed through structures of privilege rather than direct action. In the decades following the war, most of these women maintained contact with each other and with unrepentant Nazis, forming networks that preserved and transmitted Nazi ideology to subsequent generations. Their children often defended their fathers' roles and their mother's complicity, perpetuating denial and revision. The failure to fully prosecute and morally confront these women's roles contributed to incomplete reckoning with how the Nazi regime functioned and who benefited from its crimes. The final accounting reveals a troubling pattern. Emmy Goering lived comfortably for decades. Lena Heydrich ran a business and defended genocide. Margarete Himmler died unprosecuted. Sils Hess spent half a century promoting Nazi rehabilitation. These were not passive victims of history, but active participants who enjoyed the benefits of genocide and largely escaped consequences. Their stories demonstrate that justice delayed often becomes justice denied, and that complicity through privilege deserves examination alongside participation through action. In the ruins of the Third Reich, where millions of victims received no justice at all, the comfortable post-war lives of Nazi wives and mistresses represent a failure to fully confront how evil functions through networks of privilege and willful blindness. Their fates were determined not by the magnitude of crimes they enabled, but by strategic choices, gender assumptions, and incomplete pursuit of accountability. The mosquito boats had demonstrated integrated operations could achieve strategic victory. The women of the Nazi elite demonstrated that privilege insulates, ideology blinds, and incomplete justice perpetuates denial across generations.